I'm going to read from my recent novel, my last novel. Well, okay, my recent novel, Subtle Bodies. This is just a précis of the action that commences with what I'll be reading. When Douglas, the ringleader of a clique of self-styled wits of superior sensibility, dies suddenly, his 4 remaining friends are summoned to his Luke's estate high in the Catskills to memorialize his life and mourn his passing. Responding to an obscure sense of emergency in the call, Ned, one of the protagonists of this book, flies in from San Francisco, where he is the main organizer of a march against the impending Iraq War, pursued instantly by his furious wife, Nina. They are at a critical point in their attempt to get Nina pregnant. And she's ovulating. It is Nina who gives us a pointed, irreverent commentary as the friends begin to catch up with one another. She is not above poking fun at some of their past exploits and the things they held dear, and she's particularly hard on the departed Douglas, who, she thinks, undervalued her Ned. Ned is trying manfully to discern what it was that made this clutch of souls his friends to begin with, before time, sex, work, and the brutal quirks of history shaped them into who they are now, and simultaneously to guess at what will come next. Genitals have their own lives, his beloved Nina had said at the close of an argument over whether even the most besotted husband could be trusted 100%, faced with the permanent sexual temptations the world provided. It was the kind of conversation that went with the early days of a marriage, of their marriage. He had been rebutting her silly but fiendish thought experiments and had gotten tired of the game. She was a genius of imagining inescapable sex traps. There could be a nun suffering from hysterical blindness that would probably become permanent unless she received a sacrificial screw from somebody's husband. Alas. He looked around. Good thing there were no nuns on the plane. At least none in costume. When you're traveling, you're nothing until you land, which is what's good about it, Ned thought. Nina, riding in furious pursuit, felt like bucking in her seat to make the plane go faster through the night. She was still enraged. She felt like a baby. She thought, you are a baby. No, he is my lamb. Maybe the matronly, pleasant-seeming woman sitting next to her was wise. She was old enough to be. Anything was possible. And it might not hurt to talk to an adult other than my incessant mother, she thought. She had to call her mother when they landed, first thing. It's just that she won't shut up about my pregnancy, she thought. Her attempted pregnancy was what she meant. She regretted telling her mother about it. I love my mother, she wanted to tell the woman next to her. It was just that her mother was overflowing with pregnancy lore that had nothing to do with reality. She'd been unkind when her mother said, you smell differently when you're pregnant, because she'd said in response, oh really? How do you smell then, with your uterus? All her mother had been trying to say was that there was a change in the odor a woman's body gives off during pregnancy. But then her mother regularly declared that there was a mystical, subtle body inside or surrounding or emanating from every human being, and that if you could see it, it told you something. It told you about the essence of a person, their secrets, for example. It was all about attending closely enough to see them. They varied in color and brightness. Her mother claimed she could see them faintly. She wanted Nina not to be oblivious to the subtle bodies of the people she met. That would protect her from deceivers, whoever they might be. Ma suggested Ned be on the qui-vive also. Dinner, as they called it, was done with. She seemed to have twisted her napkin into a rope, and she wondered if her seatmate had noticed. The woman wasn't being especially friendly to her. Usually the people she happened to sit next to were. Yes, she was enraged at Ned, but she also felt sorry for him. May God help you, my lad, my Ned, she thought. He would be dumbfounded when he realized she had sprung after him, done it like that, like a savage beast, dropping everything herself, the same as he had, like a child, an adolescent, a child. He had never seen her truly furious, never once in 3 years of marriage. He had seen her agitated, and he had seen her annoyed, but never this. I am war, she thought. No question he deserved tenderness, which he got. On her own, she had quit referring to his acknowledged beloved clique of college friends as clowns. He hadn't asked her to, but the term had stung him a little, and this despite the fact that they had been clowns, manqués, a troupe, goofing on the world under the baton of their maestro Douglas. Now she had to control herself. She needed to be calm and alkaline. She thought, I wonder if he thinks I love taking Clomid and standing on my head après sex and him holding my feet in the air. He had left her a barely readable note. Twice since leaving, he'd called her, and each time she'd answered, I am not answering this phone. Everything had been left for her to deal with. Not only everything involving the nonprofits, not only the missent invoices and complaints about the metallic aftertaste of the coffee they were getting from their co-ops in Belize, but also calls about the demonstration he was organizing. The same calls over and over again, because this was a coalition. She hated coalitions. And why did Ned have to be the chair? She made an involuntary flinging out gesture that startled her seatmate, who flinched. Nina tried to bury the gesture in a show of policing her tray table. She doubted that the woman was deceived. Ned could be annoying without meaning to. Talking about getting pregnant, he had said about his own attitude to it, I can't decide whether I'm ambivalent or not. Which was a ghostly survival of the talky badinage-based humor of his circle of clowns, by which she meant friends, sorry. It was a slightly funny thing for him to say, but the subject wasn't funny. Nina had the window seat. She raised the window shade to study the night. Why did stadiums where no one was at play have to be lit up like Christmas? Why? But why everything, really? And why had the woman writing her up in the Contra Costa Times described her as sharp-featured? Why? Because she wasn't. And why hadn't the woman mentioned her award in the story, saying that she was the best accountant the nonprofits in the Bay Area had ever heard of? She considered her reflection in the window. Why not angular instead of sharp-featured? Well, she was going to take the bull by the horns and talk to her co-passenger. It was ordained that the woman's wallet was going to be exploding with snapshots of unblemished grandchildren. She would deal with it. She needed to talk. She needed to be with Ned now, before the 36 hours were up, so that they could do it. Had he forgotten, or did he just not care about family making? He did feel old for it sometimes. He was 48. The woman beside her opened her purse and extracted a paperback, which she seemed to be handling rather reverently, like a missile. Nina was curious. The woman moved unsubtly away, taking her elbow off the common armrest. Nina entertained the idea that the woman had sensed a core truth about her, which was that she always wanted to know what people were reading. I can't help it, she thought. She always wanted to know. It had been embarrassing from time to time when people saw her craning around inappropriately to get a clue about what they were reading. It was just that knowing made her feel better. Somebody could be reading Mein Kampf. And she didn't like people who covered their books they were reading in little homemade craft paper jackets. She couldn't help taking that as a challenge, apparently. Definitely the woman was getting tense, but she might as well relax, because Nina already knew what she was reading. She had figured it out in a glance. But I'm clumsy, she thought. Anxious, she thought it again. Then she passed her hands down her sides for no reason. The woman had bent the front cover of the paperback around to conceal the spine, and now she was slanting the book so that Nina would be required to contort herself to make out what was on the page. The woman's dual mission seemed to be to read and at the same time keep what she was reading secret from Nina. It was silly, because the cover art featuring embossed foil bolts of lightning and a cross on a blood-red field declared that the book was an entry in the genre of Christian theological thrillers that had gotten so popular. That was the last thing Nina needed to think about. The end of the world. Well, she couldn't interrupt this person when she was reading, because reading was sacred. It was to my mother, she thought. The number of times her mother had found her reading intently when it was time to set the table and given her a pass was legion. She wouldn't mind getting into an argument on Christianity, because she had a new standpoint on the subject since she had happened to marry a sort of Jesus, a secular Jesus, of course. Not that Ned would tolerate that description. So far as she knew, he had never done a bad thing, except for like a complete asshole going to the funeral of fucking Douglas, the world's greatest friend, going and just leaving her a few messages. Douglas never Doug, the rule for addressing the world's greatest friend. Nina had her own reading matter, but she was too hyper to read it. 2 poems in Poetry magazine had irritated her. In one poem, the gist was that the reader goes to the seaside and it's the sea shouting help, the sea saying help to humans, something like that. And then in another one, the poet seemed to be saying, it's closing time in the old fort, and you have to go, and you can't find your sons, so what to do? You just go back to the cannons, and you'll find them hanging around there. Everything was upsetting. And there was nothing interesting about the interior of a plane. Her seatmate swallowed a cough. Planes were unsanitary. She was breathing recirculated air, and it was Ned, his impulsiveness, Ned, who was to blame. Her fury was rising again. She knew why it was. Things she wanted, things she thought she had, being jerked away from her without warning, and at the last minute always upset her, based on patterns in her absurd childhood. Patterns she had studied and parsed and studied until she was sick unto death of the subject. But her therapist had been a Freudian, and being sick and tired of it wasn't a reason for letting go of something. The reverse! And of years of staring at the facts, she had no idea still how she should feel about her pixie parents. Up, down, sad, send them to the firing squad? How should she feel about the elf shoes with their pointy toes curving back toward her little shins that her mother had gotten on sale, making her wear them to school, insisting they were perfectly normal? She remembered the giant celebrations her parents had given when her father finally got into the Screen Extras Guild in his 50s. Was that sane? She had no idea. They did this, they did that. For any ailment, they medicated her with bark tea. Her mother had become an astrologer because it was such a portable occupation. But then they had stayed stuck in Los Angeles forever. Linda, her mother's best friend and worst influence, had branched out into astrology for pets, dogs mainly, and tried to get Ma to take it up, which she hadn't, which was something. But then, finally, late in the day, turning 34, she had found Ned and gradually gotten him to want a child and to really try with her. And then this. She thought, I take the pills. I get the shots. He vanishes. It was outrageous. It all had to do with Legrand Douglas. Douglas had been the head of Ned's clique in the 70s, the spokesmodel, when they were undergraduates, which would make it Douglas's clique, actually. They had been a group of wits, in their opinion, of superior sensibilities of some kind, was the idea. Everything she knew about Douglas was irritating. He even had his own term for the effect they were going for. Perplexion. So elegant. And then there was his legendary pensiveness, the way he would sometimes hold up his hand in a certain way to signal the group to stop talking so he could finish a thought he wasn't sharing. Then he might jot something down on a scrap of paper, or he might not. The point to her seemed to be to show that whatever was going on around him was subordinate to the great, private, productive secret, not necessarily related to anything his groundling friends were talking about, trains of thought that Douglas was having. And one thing she could not get out of her mind was that when Douglas had been the ringmaster of the group at NYU, he had demonstrated that he was the world's champion of walking out of the Thalia, walking out on foreign films he personally found highly overrated, and taking his pack of stupid fool friends along with him. She had been incredulous hearing about that, and about Ned obeying Douglas, essentially. And Ned had told her about the group going to see Last Tango in Paris, and Maria Schneider and Marlon Brando were having precoital fooling around, and in the course of it she has to go pee, and she goes into the toilet in the vacant apartment they're carousing in, and the camera follows her in, and she pees, but she gets up without wiping or using a bidet or anything. And then they had gone on to have sex. So, quelle horreur! That was enough for Douglas, who found the hygienic omission a good enough excuse to head his minions out immediately. His position had been that the omission fatally attacked the plausibility of the scene. They had been very severe about cinema, those fools. Ned's group, it was amazing to her. They had walked out on Brando at his professional and physical peak. So why had they kept going back to the Thalia, led by someone who was so sensitive that half the time their money would be spent for nothing? And what she did know with certainty was that Ned had been abandoned gradually, and then finally by this man he was racing ahead of her and her ova to praise and bury. And it had been painful, muted but painful to Ned over the years, and she knew that the abandonment had gotten more painful for Ned as Douglas got half famous in the world, debunking forgeries, significant forgeries. And Douglas had remained closer. No, Ned had known for a fact to the other three, had remained closer, Ned knew for a fact, to the other three friends. She had no idea what had led Douglas into the questioned documents business, but something had, and he'd made it pay. He'd proved that some sensational papers revealing that Alfred Dreyfus was in fact guilty of espionage were right-wing forgeries. And then someone had forged Milan Kundera's so-called love diaries, and Douglas had shot them down. And then he had married the leading gossip columnist in Czechoslovakia, the radiant Iva, a consensus great beauty. And he had gotten her over to the U.S. and put her in a tower in the woods in the Catskills near Woodstock. And they had lived in it. And there had been an inheritance. And when the internet came, there would be little fragments from Douglas to Ned, avant-garde tips on nutrition, or postings from the Committee for Ethical Tourism, which proved there was nowhere in the world you could go for a vacation except possibly Canada. She had always wanly hoped to get revenge on Douglas because there had been a truly superior soul in their little grouplet, and that had been Ned, her lad, her Ned. And there was another thing that had driven her crazy about Douglas. At first through the mail, and then by fax, and then by email, and had come a stream of very intermittent, short papers and notes from Douglas, who had become eccentric and was proposing various universal solutions to the problem of the persistence of evil in the world, in human relations. And some of them had been items like monotheism, and then it had been declining terrestrial magnetism, and there had been others, like his theory that gradual anoxia was driving mankind crazy, based on the shrinking percentage of oxygen in the atmosphere compared to the much higher oxygen content in air samples taken from bubbles in ancient Egyptian glassware. And then it had been estrogens and antidepressants infiltrating the water supply. Of course, it would be very nice if someone could prove that unkindness was caused by pollution. And Ned had always been dutiful and sent some sort of reply, trying to argue shorter and shorter replies, because Douglas almost never and then never had had anything to say to Ned in return, no expansion on the particular subject. Douglas's group had thought very highly of itself. They were going to be social renovators of some unclear kind, had been the idea, by somehow generalizing their friendship. Ned could still get solemn talking about those times. She didn't get it. And part of the original group idea had been that they would always be a unity, helping each other, maybe creating a compound in the wildwood for summer vacations, or maybe crafting some excellent retirement collective. Right, she thought. One thing she knew, and Ned did not, was that there is no permanent friendship between men, among men. Something goes wrong. Somebody marries the wrong person. Somebody advances too fast. Somebody converts. Somebody refuses good advice or bad advice. It didn't matter. It went up in a flash, like magnesium paper set on fire in a magic show. She thought, it's not always great with women either, but it can be. Women can have friends. It's more personal, she thought. Although in the great design of things, women were getting to be more like men. There were more tough cookies around, and liars. Well, Ned was her friend, her deep friend. He didn't realize it exactly. He thought everything was love with them, but it wasn't. She would have been his friend whatever. It was a standard fantasy when you fell in love to imagine you could go back in time and find your beloved growing up, peer there, save him or her, get together as adolescents by magic and go on together, fighting for one another into old age, never wavering. It was a pure friendship fantasy, not sexual. And that was why she was so enraged at the man. Enraged. She had to get this rage out of her so she could kill him when she caught up with him. He was an idiot. He was reckless. He was hopeless. He had shit for brains. He couldn't be counted on. He was a fool. These people had hurt him in the past. Douglas had. And she only knew some of it. She was moving around too much in her seat. The woman next to her was unhappy. She offered the woman her uneaten dessert, an industrial brownie still in its packaging. Nina had watched the woman devour her own brownie in 2 bites earlier. No, said the woman quite forcefully. She thinks I'm affiliated with Satan, Nina thought. His great friend was dead. Ned wanted to embrace his dead friend. An imaginary burning feeling ran across Ned's chest and down his arms. He wanted to embrace his friend. Where Douglas's body was, even, Ned didn't know. No clue whether it had been removed from the estate, no clue what shape it might be in wherever it was. Nobody could have gotten there faster from the West Coast. And still he was late, except that when the call finally came from Elliot, it had already been too late, whatever he meant by that. He meant something. Your thinking is choppy, he thought. Douglas had died when his riding mower had pitched him down into a ravine, the mower on top of him, when the ground at the edge had given way. So he had been buried once already. These were the Catskills all around. The upward road he was walking on ran through terrain jammed with trees still dripping from a monster rainstorm he had just missed. It was trees, trees, and glimpses of hill farther off, also burdened with trees, as Douglas might have put it. The ruts in the unpaved road were running like brooks. It was all uphill. There were regular trees in their last leaf, intermixed with unwelcoming, bristling evergreens. It was 4 p.m. It was muggy. That was not where he would choose to die, in a ditch in this vicinity. What had Douglas seen dying? His neck broken, the mud sliding over him. No friend near, no one around. Black mud engulfing him. Ned shrugged off his rucksack and, holding it against his chest to give his shoulders a break, continued on. He had brought too much reading matter and had so far only managed to get cursorily through 3 recent issues of The Economist. That had been during the San Francisco to Houston leg of the trip, before guilt had shut him down. He was agitated about the war that was coming, and guilty that he'd been forced to drop the little he was doing in the effort to stop it. There was going to be a march. The convergence was what they were calling it, to protest the rush toward war in Iraq. It was looking immense. Feeder marches from all over Northern California would culminate in San Francisco. Contingents were coming from as far north as Wairika, for Christ's sake. There was a coalition for the convergence, his coalition. It was funny. The anarchists were the easiest to deal with, and the Quakers were the most difficult. Oh, and of course he felt like shit about leaving Nina with so little notice, and leaving exactly when the timing on their personal project was so critical. But he couldn't think about that. That's about 20 minutes, right? Okay, well, I'll stop there.